we have been talking about, and we will tend to talk about this because this is who we are, we proceed from law, from notions of Sozialstaat and Rechtsstaat to its effects. And I'm going to try to do it backwards. I'm going to start from the effects. I'm going to start from the list, which is the reality, and then work my way backwards to law and see if by doing that we can get some insights into systems that we've already had very nicely explained in perhaps a different and perhaps more useful way, especially when we sit outside of China wondering how this will affect us without even realizing that we are deeply enmeshed in social credit systems ourselves. It's just that we like them, and so it's okay. It's okay over here. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to start with lists. Right? And lists have a long history. We love lists in the West almost as much as the Chinese love lists. We've loved them at least since the Roman period in terms of our own construction. We started with proscription lists. And usually that meant if you were on the list, for those of you who remember your Roman history in the second triumvirate, you create a list and then you die and your property is sheets to the state. We have lists of all kinds. And the lists really are manifestations of judgment to be put on the list and to announce the consequences of that judgment. The list is itself redolent with meaning. And you all know this. You figure this out, and the list becomes the performance of something, the end product of something that is complex, but tends to exhibit some kind of socially coherent manifestation, right? And again, prescription lists. But lists also hide the basis on which they're created. That's why we like them. We understand them, but we don't have to. We perform them, but we don't really have to dig deep beneath them. And what they hide is data, what we know about people, analytics, which is applying a set of normative values to give meaning to this data that we acquire, and also to decide what data we're going to use, and then assessment, how we judge the thing we have now valued through analytics. We do this all the time. It's now the Chinese state is being more scientific about it at a public level. But this is what we do, and we all hide it. We see the list, we don't see what's underlying it, and the value of the list, therefore, lies in their utility for managing effects, the way law does, right? Hierarchy, status, privileges, punishments are the key, and it's redolent, again, with significs. It's a semiotics term. The data and the analytics is itself the law, and what you wind up having is a system of hidden law, which, of course, makes people in the West crazy, although we're used to this as well. As long as it's Apple rather than the German government that does it, then it's all okay. And we do this not just with words. Who reads words anymore? We are probably the last dinosaurs who actually read words. We use color coding. It's not for nothing that we use red lists in China rather than white lists, which is what we use in the West. And we all use black lists. It's the color, the performance, right? It's shaping and sculpting that makes now law accessible to a generation that's coming that's essentially illiterate, but that likes colors. And, well, this is what we've created. Now we have to live with our project, and there it is. Right, and so what we have is lists. And we move from lists to social credit. Right, I kind of like to mock myself as I work through my slides, and that's one of the reasons for these pictures. Right, so it's in this context, when you think about lists, that you can develop a list universe system, which is Chinese social credit. Right, we do lists in the West, we fracture them, but here the Chinese are trying to do something that we can only dream about doing in a market-oriented Western society. We're going to systematize these, and we're going to use this as the expression of, and ultimately as a substitution for law and law system. And that's in the essay, which is long and endless, and no one reads words anymore, but you're welcome to look at it if you like. I go through this in a kind of more elegant way. Superscoring system that we're talking about will effectively, by the time you're done with all of this, effectively displace law, because law moves from its principles, its constitutive effect, which is all it is. Law is displaced by the analytics through which we both identify the data that is useful and convert that now useful data into judgment, which is precisely what law used to do. Law now memorializes or gives instructions to the coders to develop the precise systems for identifying the conduct. Law doesn't identify conduct anymore. It identifies principles and objectives. It's the coders that will identify the particular bits of information that become data, which is then valued in terms of your performance or not. These are all binary, 0, 1, you do it, you don't do it once it's identified. And then its aggregated accumulation becomes developed into an accessible, comparatively speaking, an accessible measure that then has color-coded consequences. That is, that then finds expression in dynamic, real-time changing listings, right? Which then finds expression in those things. So that's what I'm going to do. And just very briefly, I don't have very much time. I'm going to try to consider two questions. One, how do you build one of these superscoring systems and essentially elaborate on the point I've just made? And the second one, which is, and the role that lists play. And then what I'm going to try to do is tie all of this up to what I suspect is most of your interest in this. How do you tie this to the educational system? That is, to the challenges for both understanding your system, managing it, controlling it to the extent you can, and good luck on that, but also on the way in which you then develop a pedagogy to engage with it in whatever way it's possible to do that. All right, so the Chinese social credit system, we've already had two brilliant presentations about it. I'm not going to go on about it very much, other than to emphasize a couple of things. All right, the first is that from my perspective, when you look at this, what you really are looking at, the list itself is the triumph of a new form of regulatory expression. Law becomes secondary and at the margin. It is the principal expression, a set of instructions for coders, but the law itself is no longer central to the enterprise of management. Coding, the list, is the central element of the regulatory state, and it is founded on, necessarily, on what law is founded on, a complex system of rewards and punishments, but rather than drag you to some judge somewhere, we can now do this in real time, and we can affect you in all kinds of ways that technology has now made possible. Right, without technology, we go back to the judge. With technology, this becomes a seamless method of reinventing the relationship between the manifestations of power and its exercise on the bodies of individuals and corporate persons. It just is. But at its heart, and we can't forget this, at its heart, and we've already heard this in a variety of ways, this is not a weird machine pulling stuff out of some mechanical orifice. This is the modern expression of a moral system. And for those of us looking at this from the West, to what the Chinese are doing, it's a moral system that may be completely incompatible with our own morality. But that doesn't mean either that their system is not logically coherent and correct given their morality, nor does it mean that we can't develop the same kinds of systems and the same expressions given our own moral sense and our own moral systems. It is only a matter of time before we ourselves are enmeshed in this in our own way. So prepare. And I think my perspective, to be provocative, since I come here if you're just going to be bored, my sense is this is both inevitable and it is already well underway. And it is not clear to me that you're going to be able to stop this at all. Just its expression can be different. So it's a moral system, and we've already talked about this. It's created to steer culture towards an ideal. All societies do this. Vanguard societies, this is at the heart of their political project. We want to create, I see this all the time in Cuba, and their documents are even more excruciating than the Chinese. But when you plow through it, the object is how you can create an ideal society, which requires the creation of an ideal worker, which requires the creation of an ideal enterprise, which requires the creation of an ideal judge and an ideal party. How do you do this? In part, we do this through our core socialist values, which were developed almost at the same time: fidelity to the leadership of the party, social harmony, and a united front. Each of this is a lecture in itself, but this is essentially what we're looking at, right? And at the end of this, what are you doing? We're producing lists then to represent the end product of this process, producing conclusions related, right? Compliance with court orders, we've been through all of this, student misbehavior list, subway misbehavior list, based on factors that are weighed. We've read all of these, we've heard all of these as well. Spitting, eating loud music playing. This is a Beijing subway. Everyone loves that one because it's nice and scandalous. In order to determine whether a threshold quantum of conduct has occurred, we take all kinds of behavior data, we put it into an algorithm, we flatten it by developing a set of comparative metrics. Which one do we value more? We flatten it to a number, and we use that number to compare the quantum of behaviors of everyone in a group, and then we take a knife, like a piece of black bread, and we go slice. End, no good. Slice, like this one, middle, right? Or we slice it up into tiny pieces depending on your taste. And once you slice, you move from principle to law to specific behavior consequences to judgment, and you do not need a legislature, you do not need an administrative regulatory architecture, you do not need a judge. It's all now seamlessly bound up within, I love this word, algorithm. And ultimately, you won't need people, because if you can get machines to learn this stuff, and you'll hear about this later, you can get machines to do this stuff, all the better. Right, and so we build the super scoring system. Again, we've talked about this. And of course, from the Chinese perspective, the only thing I mention here is that because it is a moral system, it's a Leninist, a Marxist-Leninist moral system. And that is what is meant to be embedded. And part of the project, certainly since the time of Xi Jinping, has been, and not incorrectly, to argue that one of the greatest mistakes of reform and opening up was to open up China not just to the techniques of Western ways of doing things, which made them fat and rich, but by opening themselves up to the techniques, they also opened themselves up to the ideology underlying those notions. And the process that was begun in 2010, 2011 was to keep the technique and to purge it of its Western liberal democratic values. And so part of what you're seeing here is an extremely intense ideological exercise in purging the system, which means if law is redolent with Western values, we need to figure out a way of expressing law without expressing the underlying core of liberal democratic values. We need to do something else. Good, I got 5 minutes, I'll be able to finish this up. And that's what we're gonna look at. All right, so when we build this thing, again, we've talked about this, we think centrally, experiment locally, and it becomes fractured, and you've heard all of the structural dynamics. I'm not going to go through them, other than to say I made a PowerPoint that also explains it again, but you've heard it. And when you build this, ultimately, here are the big issues. Intra-institutional coordination, we've already talked about this. The public-private partnerships, vertical, horizontal coherence, and information sharing. But the only words worth looking at on this slide are these. The list becomes the mediating agent, both the product and also the expression of the success of this combination, these sets of very complex and dynamic interactions and interlinking among ideals, principles, institutions, objectives, bound up within the very fractionalized politics of the party-state system itself. All right, so what that does is, I'm just going to go through this. All of this produces a set of conclusions. So I'm going to go through the conclusions very quickly and then suggest what it means for education. And I've got like 12 of them. I'll just go through them. Each one is a different conclusion. And again, you're welcome to look at the slides in some detail. First one is the problem of the entity, right? The jurisdiction. Who's got the jurisdiction to do this? They're still fighting. State council can say everything it wants, but its authority in Yunnan may not be the same as its authority down the block in Beijing. There's all kinds of gaps that you have to worry about. Who are you going to be subject to the list? If you've got fractured jurisdiction, you may have different entities subject to different lists with different sorts of valuing system, and that is going to make the system inefficient, especially when you're dealing with enterprises. This raises the cost of production, and it may freeze the system up. They're going to have to work very hard about figuring out the class of persons or institutions that may be included, and whether, in fact, they're creating systems of opposition. The third is the objective of production. Why are we doing this? We talk about it's a moral system. We talk about the 12 socialist values, but there's all kinds of other values when you get granular, and that may create, again, contradictions that will destroy an otherwise elegant system. It can be fixed, but they have to figure it out first. The sector or class of conduct around which data is tied, when you have limited objectives, again, you can trip up over that. That's going to be a huge challenge. Data bits. Where are you going to get the data? The identification of data that's useful, data that may be useful today, may not be useful tomorrow. For those of you who have ever had to deal with data warehousing and discover that all the data it took you $1 million to produce is now obsolete and you're going to have to reinvent your data warehouse, this becomes a nightmare. Not for lawyers, but for the people who are going to substitute as lawyers. The analytics is a problem. How you draw the line is a political question. Broadcasting. The Chinese love secrecy. We do too in our private companies. They love secrecy. But this only works if you publicize the list. So how are you going to deal with a system in which you have to publicize the list and the underlying conduct, but at the same time you don't like secrets, right? That requires coordination, right? And a clearer view of consequences beyond the list, right? And all of this then poses the ultimate problem. So you've got a bunch of problems. The same kinds of problems you had in creating a legal system between, let's say, 1789 and the early 1900s. All of the problems of coordination, of jurisdiction, of compatibility, of coherence, but now driven through, identified by lists, and driven through analytics and standard setting. We are reinventing law, but we have the same problems we had when we started chopping people's heads off in what had been the Place Royale in Paris. Only heads are going to be being cut off for different reasons. And of course, that brings up the ultimate challenge. What happens if we build our own social credit systems based on our own morality in the West, and then we have to bump up against a fairly dynamic Chinese public social credit system? Ours will be private, theirs will be public. All right, so what does this mean for general education? I'll take a couple of minutes to look at this. All right, one of the problems is the one I've just mentioned. You don't look at China except through Western eyes. And that means that almost invariably, whatever you're going to think about social credit is going to be wrong. And it's going to be wrong because you're going to infuse it with your own values. So you can't actually analyze it for what it is, because what you're really analyzing is yourself. And since this is the West and we live in a culture of therapy, it's always about me, that becomes an impediment, right? And so that's one of the things we have to overcome. And for education, that's going to be difficult, right? Because you're going to have to get out of yourself in an educational system that is geared to socializing you into the very system you're going to have to put aside in order to understand this one, a competitor or oppositional system, right? And so ultimately, what that means is when you look, so that's problem number one. Problem number two, as I've suggested, is that in a sense, if you buy what I say, at least in part, then our educational system, both in terms of methodology and in terms of fundamental conception, is outdated. It is ossified. It works well for me, but I may be retiring in the next 100 years. It doesn't work well for you if you're going to spend the next 300 years in the business. The system, right, there's two things. One, right, system building like this can't be left to the engineers. Its normative element is essential, but you don't worry about this, because what we tend to do is dismiss this as garbage and then re-embrace law, when the only people who are re-embracing law are people in the universities. No one cares. You will become irrelevant and you will be replaced by merits, who will then start bringing in students, and all of a sudden you're going to have a new university. This becomes a critical value. So first is rigor in analysis. We don't have the pedagogy for that. The second is the way in which we understand and develop our academic fields. Here we're going to have to start dealing with coders, philosophers, physicists, and the like within law, and then we're going to have to figure out what the new language of law is and how to deal with those issues of law in a transposed way, right? And so it's painful. These are my last 2 points, and then I'm done. Again, I'm mocking myself there, right? Academic culture's got to change. You can't partition academic fields the way we have. We have to, I don't know what the answer is, but we have to rethink the way in which we approach law in this new managerial context. It may well be that law and business and morality are going to have to be reconceived, and we're going to have to deal with STEM people, engineers and scientists. And the second is that ideology has to be exposed as a central element of the scientific study. We tend to hide it. It makes us feel better, but it really is an ideological battle, and if you don't put it front and center, I know multiculturalism makes us all somewhat embarrassed about talking about this. It's like you can't talk about religion at the table anymore, but y'all are going to have to do it. There's just no way. These are my parting thoughts, which sound exactly like what I've said for the last 20 minutes, and you're welcome to look at it. And thank you very much.